So a quick summary of Star Trek The Apple. We had a 25-minute recording of this lecture and it didn't upload. So this is going to be a summary of that 25-minute recording for sure. So we looked at Star Trek The Apple from the original series as we continue to examine the transformative nature of contact, of cultural contact. And we looked at this episode as a continuation of Chapter 5 that explores first contact between the Europeans and the indigenous peoples of North America. We also looked at this as an extension of Chapter 5 and the consequences of first contact, which includes the slave trade that we see later today. So, first contact and Star Trek, the original series, The Apple. So this is a familiar story. In the beginning of the episode and at the end, they make parallels to the relationship between Adam and Eve and God and the location of the Garden of Eden. So when the crew of the Enterprise beamed down to the planet, many of them describe it as an idyllic place. That everything seems to be, the crops and the food seem to be plentiful, and that the weather is quite agreeable, and that if they were stranded there, it would be a nice place to be stranded. So in the beginning, the crew of the Enterprise seemed to be taking this mission as an opportunity to get out, walk in grassy fields, and to really enjoy themselves. But to kind of skip ahead a little bit, what they do find is that this isn't quite an idyllic world. That there are some rocks that are in fact landmines, and there are some flowers that have some poisonous needles. So it does, at first glance, seem to be quite idyllic, but as they look into greater detail, they find that it's quite a dangerous place. Once they come into contact with the indigenous peoples of this planet, they quite quickly realize that it is an abnormal relationship that the people have with the planet itself and with their god that they call Baal. One of the things that seems quite shocking to the crew of the Enterprise is the degree of population control on the planet. That after some quick research, Spock concludes that the people that they're coming into contact with may be thousands of years old, and they don't age, because the planet seems to be providing them the proper nutrition and environment that allows them to not change, to not age. This theme of population control is another example of this power of Star Trek to introduce, very progressively introduce what will become concerning topics, sometimes decades ahead of time. So this episode from the 60s is talking about population control at a time that the planet Earth's population was less than half of what it is today, and yet they realized that population control might be an issue that mankind would struggle with in the future. So population control, there are no youngins, there's no children born on this planet. They're all adults, they don't age, and it's a very interesting, very abnormal situation. So when Kirk and others aboard the Enterprise that are beamed down, when they look at it, much like the story of Adam and Eve, the actions of the crew of the Enterprise begin to introduce change to the people living in this idyllic Garden of Eden. And the change that they introduce, and there's a scene where Kirk is literally eating an apple, so that's not by accident, but the change that they introduce begins to create some changes in the behavior of the people of the planet. So for example, one of the changes that they introduce is a relationship between men and women. The men and women of the planet, because there is population control, don't have an affectionate, sexual relationship, Instead, they are co-villagers, but there's no coupling, right? But there's some coupling among the crew of the Enterprise. So the villagers see a couple of the members of the crew of the Enterprise kissing, and then they're like, oh man, we should maybe try it. It looks like it's pleasurable to them. Maybe we should try kissing. So this is an example of introducing change. So the villagers, they had been practicing a non-coupling kind of relationship, and then they see this couple from the Enterprise, and then they experiment with that, and Vol is unhappy. And Vol brings, rain and wind and thunder, and ends up to the point that Vol decides that, this crew of the Enterprise represents a threat to the idyllic world that he has helped create, so he tells the villagers to kill them. So the crew of the Enterprise, what they thought was the Garden of Eden, they end up looking around, and when they do realize that the people had been there unchanged for thousands of years, what we see is cultural stagnation. And this introduces another, like Star Trek often does, introduces another opportunity for us to sit back and reflect and say, is stagnation such a bad thing? Is growth an admirable quality? Does the national economy need to grow year by year? Does the global economy need to grow year by year? Do we need to have cities grow? Do we need to have always bigger, better, faster, stronger? At what cost? So that might be a conversation planted as a seed as you're watching this. But in an ethnocentric way, the crew of the Enterprise look at this Garden of Eden-like existence, and they begin to see it as a flawed society, a dystopia rather than a utopia, mainly because it's not growing, because it's stagnant. And stagnant in our culture does have a negative connotation. If water is stagnant, it can't sustain life. So we're looking at a culture that's not growing for thousands of years. The people remain unchanged, and from our perspective, rather primitive and dependent upon Vol. And the Enterprise the crew of the Enterprise decide that they should introduce some change. Well, one part of the change they introduce is the idea that they have to attack Vol, because Vol is making it so the Enterprise can't escape orbit. So then they end up killing Vol. And we'll get to what Vol is in a minute, but the idea of killing Vol, killing the god of the villagers, can be seen as controversial. Is it justified? When you come into contact with previously uncontacted peoples, and even if you see them in a relationship that might be unhealthy from our perspective, under what circumstances is it justified to change that relationship? To, in this case, kill their God, and to introduce to them our values of freedom and independence? Is it justified is something that even the crew of the Enterprise at the end are wrestling with. And then they connect back to that story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden, and then they're realizing, hey, wait a minute, what role did we just play in this? If this was like the Garden of Eden, then did we bring in temptation? Did we play the part of Satan? Was Kirk Satan in the sense that he introduced self-love, before they had devotion to their god Baal? But instead, now they have this idea of independence from Baal. Well, they have to be because the Enterprise killed Baal, but the idea that they can, independent of Baal, progress and evolve and have a better life and have freedom and independence and make their own choices, like not have population control, but have children, something that seems very natural, but something that they had not had. So in the beginning, this is presented as an idyllic world. But even in this idyllic world, there are these landmines that are rocks and these poisonous flowers that I alluded to. And the point of that is to create that kind of dystopian feel, that there is a flaw to an idyllic world. That in much other works of dystopian literature, like The Giver or The Village, that from at first glance these cultures seem idyllic, but there's something wrong with them. And in this case, the people that worship Vol, they lacked independence, they lacked freedom, they lacked choice and opportunity, and they didn't have children. They didn't have that transformative feeling of being a parent or having children within their village. So that's what made it not idyllic. And also the idea that the rocks were landmines. One thing that we did in our discussion is I asked the class and we talked about, who put the rocks there? Are these rocks natural to the world, or did Vol perhaps have them placed there? And if so, for what purpose? And we concluded that the rocks were there to create a barrier between the villagers and the outsiders, and a barrier that creates a bit of a prison but also protects the villagers. So then we started getting into Vol and the nature of Vol. So who or what exactly is Vol? So Vol is a machine that is technology well beyond the people of the planet. So it's safe to assume that Vol is alien to the people, alien to the planet. But because of Vol's amazing ability to provide for the people and to stop things like aging, Vol has become a god to the people. Now the people feed Vol, which is somewhat unnecessary because Vol is a machine. So they are seen bringing food down into the bowels of where Vol resides within this machine. So they feed Vol. So it's the idea, what can I do for my God to show my obedience and love? But at the same time, Vol is controlling, manipulating, stagnating these people of his planet. Now, it's a moot point because, again, the Enterprise destroyed Vol. But what the episode allows us to do is really ask some very deep questions in the sense of, the transformative nature of cultural contact is a big thing. Definitely the Enterprise, the Federation's contact with these once isolated people has completely changed their culture to the extent that we kill their god. But also, because we transformed their culture, we can ask the related question, is it justified? If Vol was alien, if Vol was manipulative, if Vol was controlling and suppressive and stagnating the people, were the actions of the crew of the Enterprise justified, or did we play the part of Satan? Did we introduce self-love and temptation to what could have been an idyllic world? They had everything they needed. They had nothing of want. But they had very little in the sense of relationships of a sensual or sexual nature among each other, and they had very little of that self-love and change and progress. But is that, or should that be our goal? What is the purpose of life? The purpose of their life, their long lives, before the Enterprise interrupted them, was to serve Vol. And they were rewarded for it, much like Adam and Eve. But then after the destruction of Vol, their purpose became a lot less known. And the crew of the Enterprise tried to comfort them and say, you will be free and we will help you be independent. And there's irony there in the sense, I'm going to help you be independent of Vol. Now I'm kind of becoming the new Vol that you're dependent upon. So irony aside, is that transformation a good thing? Now we have pockets of people in the world today, much like the people that worship Vol. We have uncontacted tribes, dozens of them remaining in the Amazon. And we may look from outside in, and we may see people that are quite limited. But does that make it right for us to go in and change their value sets, change their culture, and assimilate them into ours? At what point should we just leave them alone? So this leads to the prime directive in Star Trek, the idea that some uncontacted people must remain uncontacted until they have warp capability, so that they have organically grown their own technology to be that similar to the alliance that is the Federation. But what if you look in to an uncontacted people and you see that they're being manipulated and suppressed and oppressed, and that their stagnation and their lives are not fulfilled? Should we intervene? But the other question here is, what is a fulfilled life look like? Maybe service to Vol is a fulfilled life. Maybe all they're doing here in an ethnocentric way is projecting their values on someone else. So as we look at globalization, as cultures come into contact with each other, we look at the idea of the transformative nature of cultural contact and the contamination of values that follows. And historically, we have lots of great examples in Chapter 5 that we will be unpacking together, and Chapter 7, including ones locally here with the indigenous people as they came into contact with Europeans. But it's sometimes insightful to look at the hypothetical, the theoretical, the works of literature like Star Trek, and to really look at the roots of what we're doing when we're transforming each other. All right, so that's an attempt at recapturing some of what we talked about in class. No doubt I've missed a lot of our key points, but at least it's something.